Morning from New York, I'm Chris Hayes here with Joan Walsh, Salon.com's editor-at-large, Karen Hunter, MSNBC contributor and Up regular, Jodi Kantor, author of the book The Obamas, and Baratunde Thurston, author of the book How to Be Black. I also have with us Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And Michelle, Karen Hunter had a question she wanted to ask you.
Well, I was reading the book last night, and, you know, when we think of America, we don't think of this caste system being even possible here, and that just struck me. But the other thing, you call it Jim Crow, but I think it's deeper than that. You know, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery with one exception, the prison system. If you're incarcerated, you're legally a slave in this country, and how do we break through that? You know, I'm reading it and I felt so depressed. I'm like, how do we break through that? And one other thing, I'm sorry.
Please.
I was under the impression that the war on drugs started, you know, under the Reagan era to weed out crack in the black communities. And what Michelle was saying in her book is that the war on drugs happened, and then the crack explosion happened after it. How is that possible?
Yes, well, many people assumed, in fact, for a long time I believed it was the case that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine and the related violence in inner city communities. But it's just not true. President Ronald Reagan declared our current drug war in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was before, not after crack really began to ravage inner city communities and become a media sensation. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. At the time he declared it, drug crime was actually on the decline. So why declare a drug war when drug crime is actually on the decline and the American public isn't too much concerned about it? Well, from the outset, you know, the war on drugs had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction and drug abuse, and nearly everything to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of that grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who are anxious about and resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. So when President Ronald Reagan declared his drug war, it was an effort to make good on campaign promises to get tough on a group of people not so subtly defined by race.
Michelle, let me just say one thing, which is I'd like you to respond to. I mean, hearing that, I think that tracks with the way that I think about the politics of this, and your book is persuasive on this point. But it also is the case, right, that we had this remarkable explosion of crime in the country that created the conditions, created a receptivity among the populace for the message. I mean, the crime rates really do go really haywire in the 60s and 70s in a way that just hadn't happened before or since. There was this bizarre anomalous period. So that wasn't whether the strategy behind it was completely this cynical manipulation of politics among the populace. I think there was genuine concern about safety, that the two kind of met each other with sort of awful consequences.
Right. Perfect storm.
Absolutely. Rising crime rates in the 70s, you know, absolutely created an environment in which the public was very receptive to the get tough rhetoric. I mean, it wasn't just that pollsters found that, you know, those types of get tough messages could appeal to poor and working class whites. There was, you know, severe crime problem in many cities. As sociologist William Julius Wilson has shown, that crime problem wasn't due to, you know, something wrong with black culture or people all of a sudden, you know, developing some kind of pathology and predisposition to crime. The reason for the increase in the crime rates was a sudden wave of joblessness in urban areas as factories closed down and began to kind of move overseas, and technological innovation rendered so many of the jobs that particularly black men had once relied upon for their basic living vanished. Hundreds of thousands of jobs vanished practically overnight in cities across America. And we could have responded to this sudden crisis, this wave of joblessness, with, care, compassion, and concern, right, economic stimulus packages, job creation programs, investing in education so folks could make the rough transition to a new service-based economy. But instead of doing all of that, we declared a war on drugs and began to round people up in mass, viewing them as largely disposable.
Michelle, Jody Kantor had a question for you.
Michelle, we were just talking about the fact that President Barack Obama is so aware of the issues that you write about, and so is Attorney General Eric Holder. How do you rate their performance on these issues?
Well, to be honest, I'm quite disappointed. And the reason is that, there has been a shift in the rhetoric, but not a meaningful shift in policy. Barack Obama's drug czar, Gil Kralowski, has said we shouldn't call this a war on drugs anymore because we ought not be at war with our own people. And that, of course, is absolutely right. But if you actually take a look at the Obama administration's drug control budget, the Obama administration invests about the same ratio of dollars in enforcement as compared to drug prevention or treatment as the Bush administration. And so we've seen a shift in rhetoric, but I don't think we've yet seen the kind of change in policy that would be necessary for, it to have a real impact on the ground. So we've got to do more than just talk about these issues differently. We're going to have to actually roll back the very policies that have led to the prison boom.
Michelle, Baratunde Thurston wanted to ask you a question.
First, on behalf of people who care about justice, just thank you so much. You are a great spokesperson for a great cause that doesn't get attention. Secondly, I want to talk about this opportunity cost, not just of treating and labeling people as prisoners, but especially of young people and actual children, the criminalization of children, their families, and the broken juvenile justice system. I have a friend who worked with the Ella Baker Center in Oakland, who started an organization called Justice for Families that tries to destigmatize the parents and the families of these kids. What do you see happening positively? What more needs to happen around our youth who are also being poisoned with this label and having their whole futures written off?
Well, I have to say, I'm so inspired by the work of the Ella Baker Center in Oakland. They've launched launched campaigns to close juvenile prisons in California, successful campaigns to close juvenile prisons in California, and they've shown the power of youth organizing, that blending hip-hop culture with consciousness raising among young people can be potent and really powerful. So I think there's examples of organizing efforts, youth-led organizing efforts all over the country where people are coming together and demanding education, not incarceration, jobs, not jails. And I think that's the most hopeful sign. It's unreasonable, in my view, to expect that politicians are going to sing a different tune unless there really is a groundswell, a mobilization from the bottom up. And so groups like the Ella Baker Center, I think, really are leading the way.
Michelle Alexander, on a hopeful note, and I think one hopeful note to think about is if in the same way the spike in crime in the 1970s created the preconditions among the population to be receptive to the worst kind of message on this issue, perhaps the diminution of crime in the last 10 years will create some latitude in politically, I think that, among the populace to actually rethink the way that we approach crime and criminal justice. I want to thank Michelle Alexander, law professor at Ohio State University and author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.